No one saw what was about to happen.
March 1991, Universal Studios. Soundstage 27. Dolph Lundgren was 6 weeks deep into production on Showdown in Little Tokyo, running through a take while the crew reset around him for the next setup. The afternoon was routine, the kind of working day on a Hollywood film set where everyone knows their role and nobody expects anything unusual to interrupt it. He had no idea Chuck Norris was about to walk through that door. And he definitely had no idea that before the sun went down on that Thursday, he would end up flat on the floor of that soundstage, put there by a man in jeans and brown boots who hadn't even come looking for a fight. What happened in those 58 seconds would move quietly through the Los Angeles stunt community for years, person to person, low voice to low voice. The kind of story that doesn't get written down because the people who were there understood exactly what they had witnessed, and they understood that some things belong to the room where they happened, but the story is real. And it starts not with Dolph, not with Chuck, but with a phone call made 1 week earlier by a young man named Brandon Lee. Brandon had been working towards something on Showdown in Little Tokyo that mattered to him deeply. This was his legitimate shot at an English-language breakout role. Not a supporting performance, not a cameo riding his father's legacy, an actual starring role where his own ability had to carry the weight. The fight choreography on the production was unlike anything he had tackled before. Extended full-contact exchanges, weapon sequences, stunt falls with real impact. He was holding his own, but there was one specific transition inside the dojo sequence, a particular movement between two strikes that had been the source of a 2-day disagreement between him and the stunt coordinator. Neither of them could agree on the angle. Neither of them could resolve it cleanly. So Brandon picked up the phone and called the person he trusted most in those situations, Chuck Norris. Chuck had known Brandon since Brandon was a child. He had stood at the back of a church in Hong Kong in 1973 and watched Bruce Lee be buried. He had carried that afternoon with him for 18 years. When Bruce's son called and asked for help, there was no version of that conversation where the answer was anything other than yes. He arranged to come to the set. He was told to come in through the side entrance and wait near the stunt coordinator's chairs. He showed up exactly when he said he would. Denim jacket, brown boots, no ceremony. Now here's what you need to understand about Dolph Lundgren at this particular moment in his life, because it matters enormously for what happened next. He was 33 years old, 6 feet 5 inches tall, 245 pounds, 2 European Kyokushin karate championships before his 23rd birthday, a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney, a film career that had already put him in Rocky IV, Masters of the Universe, and Red Scorpion, and a reputation inside the stunt community that nobody argued with lightly because they all knew the chest punch on the Rocky IV set hadn't been a performance. Sylvester Stallone spent 9 days in intensive care afterward. The punch had been real, and everyone in Hollywood knew it. Dolph carried himself the way a man carries himself when nothing in his environment has given him a reason to reconsider his own assessment of where he stands. He had competed at the highest levels of contact karate on 2 continents. He had trained alongside some of the most physically capable men in the world, and nothing he had encountered on a Hollywood film set had offered him any serious counter-evidence. But underneath all of that, something had been building for 6 weeks that he hadn't said out loud to anyone. He believed the production was being organized around Brandon Lee's name rather than around his own talent. He believed Brandon had landed the role because of his father's legacy, not because of what Brandon himself had earned. He believed that American martial arts cinema had spent 20 years living inside Bruce Lee's shadow, treating that shadow as though it were substance. And the longer he worked on that set, the more that belief calcified into something that wanted to come out. He had been carrying it around like a stone in his jacket. Waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting. For the right moment walked through the side door at 3 in the afternoon. Brandon came out of his trailer in workout clothes a minute after Chuck arrived. He crossed the soundstage and his whole face changed when he saw Chuck sitting on an apple box near the stunt coordinator's chairs. It was a genuine smile, the first one the crew had seen from him all week. He sat down on the floor near Chuck the way a younger person sits near someone whose presence makes them feel steadier. Two stunt veterans recognized Chuck and walked over. Word began moving across the floor in that careful, measured way that information moves on a working film set where people are paid to stay focused. Chuck Norris is here. Chuck, sitting with Brandon. Dolph noticed the gathering from across the stage. He noticed Brandon specifically, the 26-year-old co-star he had been silently frustrated with for 6 weeks, suddenly relaxed and happy in a way he hadn't been during the entire production. Something shifted in Dolph's expression, a tightening around the eyes. A decision forming before the decision was fully conscious. He set down his towel. He began walking across the soundstage. He walked the way a man walks, when his mind is already 3 steps ahead of his feet. He stopped 4 feet from Brandon and Chuck. He looked directly at Chuck without any acknowledgement. He spoke to Brandon instead. "Who's the old guy?" The Swedish accent gave the words just enough lightness that a generous reading was technically available. The expression on his face made the generous reading impossible. Brandon stood. "Dolph, this is Chuck Norris." Something moved across Dolph's face in the 1 second that followed, a processing. Then the smile appeared, the kind of smile a man produces when he has already decided what he intends to say next, and the smile is just the opening punctuation. He kept speaking to Brandon, the specific technique of addressing someone about another person while that person is standing right there. "Brandon, you brought Chuck Norris here to teach you stunts?" Brandon said nothing. "What can he actually teach you about real impact, about defending yourself in a real situation?" "Nothing. You've got the wrong man standing here," Brandon said quietly. "Dolph, stop." Dolph did not stop. He turned slightly, addressed Chuck directly now. The smile held. "No disrespect to your career, Chuck, genuinely. But you couldn't land a clean shot on me if I stood completely still and let you swing. That's not an insult, it's just the truth, and that's why you shouldn't be the one coaching this kid." The word kid was deliberate, said in front of Brandon Lee, said on the soundstage where Brandon Lee was the lead. The stunt coordinator set a clipboard down on a case. The Steadicam operator turned his head without moving his feet. The A-camera operator raised his eye to his viewfinder for no reason that had anything to do with the camera. The craft services attendant stopped walking with a coffee pot in his hand and did not start again. 12 people on that soundstage were now watching the apple boxes. Brandon Lee looked like he had aged backward about 18 years. Chuck did not stand up. He looked up at Dolph from the apple box. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who has been challenged by larger people in front of smaller audiences throughout most of his adult life, and who has long since stopped finding it surprising. He said 3 things. "I came here for Brandon. I'm not here for you. Walk yourself back to your trailer. No heat in it. No performance. The tone of a man who means what he is saying and has no particular investment in whether the other person believes him yet." Dolph laughed, one short, cold sound. "Stand up, Chuck." The laugh closed the door on every exit. The room understood that Dolph had heard the offer and chosen not to take it. Brandon said, "Dolph, please." Chuck looked at Brandon for a moment. He placed one hand briefly on Brandon's shoulder. Then he stood up from the apple box. He folded the denim jacket once, placed it neatly across the box. Underneath, he wore a plain white t-shirt tucked into the jeans. He kept the jeans. He kept the brown boots. He did not loosen his shoulders. He did not find a wider stance. He did not do any of the things a man does when he is preparing for something and wants the room to register that he is preparing. He simply walked 10 feet to the open space between the equipment and stopped there. The cleared area was roughly 12 feet square. Not much room. On one side sat the A camera on its dolly track, a fresh magazine loaded and ready. On the other side, the Steadicam rig on its stand. Behind Chuck, a stack of apple boxes and a sandbag column. Behind Dolph, a C-stand rigged with a flag and an HMI light that represented $50,000 of rental equipment. The stunt team formed a loose ring around the space. Nobody told them to. Nobody had to. Brandon Lee stood behind the apple boxes, hands at his sides, watching the way a person watches something they are powerless to stop and not entirely sure they want to. Dolph removed his character's leather jacket and dropped it across a wardrobe rail. He stayed in the black turtleneck and tactical pants of his role. He took his Kyokushin stance, weight dropped low, hands held tight, everything in the compact and precise configuration that had won him 2 continental championships. Chuck stood with his hands loose at his sides, weight distributed evenly across both feet. No stance. Eyes on Dolph, that was all. Dolph opened with the combination that had finished his European Championship bouts. Low kick targeting Chuck's lead leg, straight cross following immediately behind it. Practiced thousands of times, mechanically precise. Chuck checked the low kick with his shin. He did not retreat. He slipped the cross with approximately 6 inches of head movement to one side. His feet did not move. Dolph reset. The first trace of something new appeared in his expression. Not alarm, not yet, more like a recalibration. A flicker of recognition that the target was behaving differently than any target he had encountered in a very long time. He committed punch, punch, roundhouse. The exact combination that had defined his Kyokushin career at its highest competitive level. The punches didn't connect. The roundhouse reached the end of its arc against empty air because the man it was aimed at was no longer standing in the place he had been standing. Dolph's shin continued through the full rotation and connected with the A-camera dolly. The dolly rolled sideways on its track with significant force. The camera magazine came loose, exposed film unspooled across the soundstage floor in a long ribbon. A focus puller shouted from the edge of the ring, 50,000 frames of exposed film on the floor because of a shin. Dolph was angry now. The cold, controlled kind of angry that compresses rather than expands. He came forward hard, trying to close the distance and get inside Chuck's kicking range, where his Kyokushin combinations could land with their full architecture. He bridged Chuck's lead hand and got a brief purchase on Chuck's shoulder. For 1/2 second they were tied together, and the size difference was impossible to miss. 65 pounds, 6 inches of height, all of it on Dolph's side of the equation. Chuck broke the clinch with an elbow placement to Dolph's solar plexus. Controlled pressure, the kind of contact that communicates a precise message. I am here. I could go further. I am choosing not to. Dolph staggered back half a step. He recovered and drove forward again, this time with his shoulder, using his frame as a battering ram the way physically dominant men do when the technical approach has not produced the expected result. Chuck pivoted 45 degrees. He accepted Dolph's momentum. He redirected it. Dolph went past Chuck and into the Steadicam rig. $80,000 of precision counterweight gimbal went over with the loudest sound heard on that stage all afternoon. The Steadicam operator, who had been standing very still at the edge of the ring, made a sound that was not a word. The director, who had been at the video village 20 feet away watching all of this unfold in the way directors watch things they cannot stop and cannot look away from, was now running across the floor shouting at people to intervene. The stunt coordinator stepped into the space between them, hands raised. Dolph, Chuck, that's enough. Dolph looked past him at Chuck. No. Brandon Lee stepped in front of the stunt coordinator. He spoke directly to Dolph in a low voice. Walk away. Dolph looked at him, the moment where it could have ended entirely. He stepped around the stunt coordinator. He threw the spinning back kick. This was the technique, the signature, the kick he had thrown literally 10,000 times in training and competition and on film sets across 3 countries. The kick that had sent a stunt double into a wall on the Rocky IV set hard enough that production stopped for the rest of the day. The kick that, when Dolph Lundgren threw it with full commitment, had no recorded failure. Chuck read it a quarter second before it was thrown. He stepped inside the kick's chamber, inside the arc, before it could develop its power. The kick passed completely behind him. As Dolph rotated through the full motion, his back was briefly toward Chuck. Chuck stepped off the line. He waited for the rotation to complete. Dolph came around, expecting Chuck to be where he had been. Chuck had moved off his axis, his weight distributed wrong. Dolph threw a desperate right hand. Chuck caught the wrist. He rotated it over. He stepped underneath the extended arm. He placed his right leg behind Dolph's planted lead leg and swept. 245 pounds arrived on the Universal Studios soundstage floor without choosing to arrive there. The sound of it was louder than the Steadicam had been. Chuck did not release the wrist. He dropped one knee onto Dolph's shoulder. He placed his free hand flat on the center of Dolph's chest. He held him there. 58 seconds from the first kick to the floor. The soundstage went completely silent. Chuck held the position for a long count. 15 seconds. He did not speak. He did not look at the crew. He kept his eyes on Dolph, and he held the pressure, and he let the position speak for itself. Dolph's breathing was the loudest thing in the building. Dust drifted through the working lights above them. The director stood frozen 10 feet away. Brandon stood where he had been standing throughout. The stunt coordinator said later that what stayed with him most was not the sweep itself, it was what happened in those 15 seconds on the ground. He said he realized in that count that Chuck hadn't been competing with Dolph for the previous 58 seconds. He had been reading him. The shin check, the head slip, the pivot, the wrist catch, each one was data collection. The floor was just the conclusion. The teaching hold was Chuck showing Dolph the answer to a problem Dolph hadn't known he was being examined on. What the soundstage didn't know that afternoon, what nobody in the loose ring of stunt professionals and camera operators and crew members could have known, was that Chuck Norris had been in this exact room before. Not this building, not this city, but this configuration. In 1968, in Long Beach, California, Chuck had been the younger man, decorated, confident, completely certain of what he had built inside himself through years of competition and training. He had been 6-time world karate champion. He had believed without arrogance but with full conviction that he understood what combat at the highest level looked like. Then Bruce Lee had invited him onto a mat. Bruce was smaller, Bruce was quieter, Bruce did not announce anything. He simply moved, and everything Chuck thought he knew about the ceiling of human martial capability had to be rebuilt from the floor up. Bruce hadn't embarrassed him, he'd educated him, but the lesson required the floor first. Chuck had carried that lesson for 23 years. Through every championship that came after, through every film set, through Walker, Texas Ranger, through every dojo and cleared space and casual challenge, he had carried it as the single most important thing he had ever been shown. There is a level above the level you believe is the top, and the only way to find out it exists is to meet the man who lives there. Bruce had been that man for Chuck, and now Chuck was standing in a Universal Studios soundstage with Bruce's son watching from the apple boxes. He hadn't planned any of this. He had come to look at a transition in a dojo sequence. That was the reason he was on the stage. What happened on the way to that was not something he had engineered, but the lesson was the same lesson, and it needed to be received the same way. After the long count, Chuck released the wrist. He stepped off Dolph's shoulder. He extended his hand downward. The two senior stunt veterans at the edge of the ring said later that they saw the decision being made in real time on Dolph's face as he lay there. Two paths. Take the hand, acknowledge what had happened in front of the people watching it happen. Or stand up independently, walk to the trailer, absorb the equipment losses as a production incident, find a story that made it mean something else. Dolph was on the floor for 2 full seconds. He took the hand. Chuck pulled him up to standing. Dolph stood 2 feet away from him. The tactical costume was dusty. A strip of unspooled film had adhered to his trouser leg. His hair was damp at the temples. He looked at Chuck for a long moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about you. I didn't know what you were. I apologize to you and to Brandon." Chuck nodded once. He spoke quietly, without any weight of victory in it. "You're going to be in this industry for a long time. Don't make that statement again to the next man until you've actually watched him work." Dolph turned to Brandon. The apology was direct, real. Brandon nodded and they shook hands. Brief, no theater in it, just two men arriving at the other side of something. Chuck turned back to Brandon and placed one hand on the back of his neck the way an older relative does when they're guiding you somewhere you need to go. "All right. Let's go look at that transition." They walked together toward the mat where the dojo sequence was set up. The director, who had spent the last several minutes standing with his mouth slightly open, fell in behind them because he understood that something had just reorganized itself on his production, and he knew which side of that reorganization he wanted to be on. Dolph stood alone for a moment near the destroyed Steadicam rig. Then he walked back to his trailer. Chuck spent the next 90 minutes on the mat with Brandon. Just the two of them working through the specific transition, the movement between two strikes that had been the source of 2 days of disagreement. Chuck identified why the angle was wrong. He demonstrated the correction. Brandon tried it. He found it on the 3rd attempt. The director quietly pointed a camera at the session and recorded the footage. It was never released. The fight with Dolph had been a detour. The reason Chuck had come through the side door was always Brandon. The financial accounting of that afternoon $140,000 in equipment damage. Universal Studios categorized it as a rehearsal incident. No police report was filed. No insurance claim named either man specifically. The director's written report to the studio noted only that a stunt rehearsal had run long and resulted in equipment loss. Nobody on that soundstage spoke to a journalist about what they had seen. The story traveled the way these things travel in a closed professional community, through personal conversations at the end of long days, in parking lots after rap. The A-camera operator told his apprentice 3 years later. The Steadicam operator told the story once at a Christmas party in 1994, replaced his rig with production insurance, and never told it again. The stunt coordinator told his wife the same night it happened. The two senior stunt veterans who had worked with Chuck in the 1970s, who had known from the moment he stood up from the apple box that the outcome was already decided, they told no one, as far as anyone knows, ever. Dolph finished the production. He hit every mark. He delivered every line. He completed the dojo sequence with Brandon, and the people who worked those final 2 weeks said the atmosphere was genuinely different. Something had settled on the set that hadn't been there before. He went back to Kyokushin training in Stockholm that autumn. The senior instructor at his dojo said he came back quieter than he had left. He came back asking different questions, not about combinations or timing or competitive strategy, but about the foundational things, the basics. The instructor said it was the particular quality of return he had seen in fighters who had been shown the ground by someone they didn't expect to be capable of putting them there. Something had shifted in Dolph on that floor, and it stayed shifted. The people who worked with him on productions that followed reported a different kind of presence. He listened to stunt coordinators in ways he hadn't listened before. He asked younger performers about their training rather than assessing them silently. He stopped driving combinations through people with the kind of force that treated a film set like a competition floor. The chest punch that had hospitalized Stallone in 1985 never appeared on a set again. In 1996, on a production in Bulgaria, a young stunt performer said something challenging to Dolph between setups. The crew that had heard stories about how Dolph used to respond to that kind of moment held their breath. Dolph looked at the young man for a long count. Then he walked back to his trailer. The stunt coordinator on that Bulgaria film had also worked Showdown in Little Tokyo. He said later that he was the only person on that Bulgarian set who fully understood what he had just watched happen. Dolph Lundgren did not mention Chuck Norris in a single interview for 33 years. In 2003, a Japanese martial arts podcast with a small international audience asked him who the most formidable opponent he had ever encountered was. He was quiet for longer than the interviewer expected. Then he answered in English, an older American on a soundstage wearing jeans. "I don't think about him often, but when I do, I think about him." He did not say the name. He didn't need to. Brandon Lee finished the film. 2 years later, on March 31, 1993, Brandon died on the set of The Crow in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was 28 years old. Chuck Norris attended the funeral. He sat 2 rows behind Linda Lee Cadwell. He did not speak to the press afterward. Dolph sent flowers. He did not attend. In the years that followed, whenever an interviewer brought up Brandon's name in conversation with Chuck, he said the same thing each time. He said Brandon had been the most naturally gifted young martial artist of his generation. He said Brandon had a quality in front of a camera that couldn't be manufactured or taught. Interviewers pushed for stories. Chuck always moved the conversation somewhere else. There are 2 reasons a man teaches another man something with his hands. The first is to win. The second is to honor someone. On that Thursday afternoon in March 1991, on Soundstage 27 at Universal Studios, Chuck Norris taught Dolph Lundgren something he had not set out to teach. The lesson was real. The floor was real. The 58 seconds were real. But the reason Chuck was on that stage at all, the reason he had driven to Universal Studios, walked through the side entrance, folded his denim jacket, and sat on an apple box waiting, had nothing to do with Dolph Lundgren. The reason was sitting on the floor near the apple boxes. The reason had been 8 years old in 1973, in a church in Hong Kong watching his father be buried. The reason was Brandon Lee. And everything else that happened that afternoon was just what occurred on the way to the thing Chuck actually came for.